It was an unusually chilly morning in San Francisco, with fog rolling in thick over the bay. The streets hummed with the sound of engines and hurried footsteps as the city shook off its slumber. Among the bustling taxis, buses, and sleek cars, a nondescript electric taxi glided silently along the pavement. At first glance, it was just like any other vehicle navigating the chaotic downtown traffic. Its driver? A man who seemed too unremarkable to notice. He wore a simple cap pulled low, shadowing his face. A crisp navy blue jacket hung loosely on his frame, blending into the sea of everyday commuters. His hands, resting lightly on the wheel, were steady and calm, betraying no sense of urgency despite the honking horns and impatient drivers around him. When he stopped to pick up his first passenger, he offered a polite smile, warm but almost practiced. "Morning," he said simply as the passenger climbed in. There was nothing unusual about his voice, no hint of anything extraordinary. Yet, if you looked closer, really looked, you might notice something in his eyes. They weren't the tired, distracted eyes of someone who spent their days driving strangers around for tips. Instead, they were sharp, calculating, almost as if they were studying every detail around them. But who notices their taxi driver? To most passengers, he was just a means to an end, a ride to their destination, nothing more. As the car wove through the city streets, the driver asked the typical small talk questions. "Busy day ahead. Weather's been odd, hasn't it?" His tone was friendly, unassuming. Passengers responded absent-mindedly, barely looking up from their phones or newspapers. They didn't realize the man behind the wheel was paying closer attention than they were. He caught every word, every expression. His passengers ranged from hurried office workers clutching coffee cups to tourists snapping pictures through the car windows. One man, a lawyer, judging by the expensive suit and the Bluetooth earpiece permanently attached to his ear, barely acknowledged the driver as he barked orders into his phone. "Can you speed up?" the lawyer snapped without looking up. "I can't be late." "Sure," the driver said, his voice calm, almost amused. He didn't argue, didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his speed, maneuvering through the lanes with an ease that suggested years of practice or something more. The morning passed in much the same way. Passenger after passenger climbed in and out of the car, each leaving behind a faint trace of their stories. And through it all, the driver remained steady, observing, noting, thinking. If you were to ask anyone who took a ride that day to describe their driver, they'd struggle to remember much about him. Maybe they'd recall his quiet politeness or the way he seemed unusually composed for someone navigating the chaos of the city. But none of them would have guessed the truth about him. Because this wasn't just any driver. Underneath the plain cap, the ordinary jacket, and the calm demeanor was someone who didn't belong in this car or even on these streets. Someone who had no reason to be ferrying strangers around the city. Someone whose real life was so far removed from this world that it bordered on impossible. But he was here, and there was a reason for it. You see, this driver had a secret so big that if any of his passengers had known, they wouldn't have been able to sit still. They would have stared, wide-eyed, fumbling for their phones to capture proof that yes, it was really him. Because this wasn't just a taxi driver. This was Elon Musk. He had woken up that morning, same as any other, but instead of stepping into a world of boardrooms, prototypes, and high-stakes decisions, he had slipped quietly into this role. A disguise. An experiment. A chance to see the world through someone else's eyes, or perhaps to see the world's view of him without the filter of fame and fortune. But why? Why would a billionaire, a visionary known for revolutionizing industries, trade his life of innovation for one of traffic jams and impatient passengers? The answer lay in the city itself. Somewhere in its tangled streets and glassy skyscrapers was a problem he needed to solve, a challenge that couldn't be understood from the confines of an office or a mansion. And so, he had done what no one would expect, he had gone undercover. It wasn't the first time Elon Musk had stepped outside the boundaries of what people thought possible. He had built companies that reshaped industries, taken risks that others called reckless, and faced criticism from every angle. Yet here he was, slipping unnoticed into the fabric of everyday life. For him, this wasn't just about curiosity. It was about finding something no amount of reports, data, or meetings could reveal. And until he found it, he would remain in this unremarkable role, an invisible player in a city full of stories. But what he didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that this ordinary day would lead to something extraordinary. By the time the sun set over San Francisco, the lives of the people he encountered would be changed forever. And so would his. To the passengers climbing into his car, he was just another driver. To the world, he was one of the most influential minds of his generation. But in this moment, he was something else entirely. He was a mystery. And the story was just beginning. The morning unfolded in the usual, unremarkable rhythm of the city. Elon's cab moved seamlessly from one corner to the next, blending into the pulse of San Francisco like a single note in a symphony. He remained invisible, a shadow, quietly absorbing the lives of others while cloaking his own. As he turned onto Market Street, the next passenger flagged him down with a hurried wave. A young woman in her mid-20s, she had a laptop bag slung over her shoulder and an air of controlled chaos about her. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she held her phone in one hand, typing furiously as she climbed into the back seat. "Thanks," she muttered, not looking up. "Can we get to Hayes Valley in 10 minutes? I'm running late for a pitch meeting." Elon glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "I'll do my best," he said. "Yeah, well, I can't afford to be late," she added, almost to herself. "My whole career is riding on this." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and Elon noticed her tapping her foot nervously against the floor. She didn't look like someone who often asked for help, but desperation was etched in her tone. "What's the pitch about?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. She blinked, startled by the question. Most drivers didn't bother with small talk unless it involved traffic. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "It's for a startup," she said. "We're developing a sustainable packaging alternative, something to replace plastic without costing a fortune. If this goes well, we might get the funding we need to actually launch. If it doesn't," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Sounds important," Elon said, navigating through a gap in traffic with practiced ease. "Good luck." She gave a small, distracted smile, her eyes glued to her phone as she rehearsed her pitch silently. Elon didn't press further. It wasn't his place, or at least, not as a cab driver. But something about her story stuck with him. As they neared her destination, she glanced up at the meter. Her expression tightened. "Can we make it cash only?" she asked, biting her lip. Elon nodded. He'd seen that look before, though not often from his vantage point as a billionaire. She was calculating every dollar, probably wondering how much she could afford to tip. When they arrived, she fumbled through her wallet and handed him a crumpled bill. "Thanks," she said hurriedly, grabbing her bag. "Break a leg," Elon replied, watching her disappear into the building. He didn't need to know what happened next to understand her struggle. He'd been there once, long before Tesla, SpaceX, or even PayPal. The uncertainty, the fear of failure, the weight of a single opportunity, it was all too familiar. And yet, this wasn't about him. Today, he was just a driver, a quiet observer of the city's stories. The next passenger was a complete contrast, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit with an air of impatience so palpable it practically entered the car before he did. He barely acknowledged Elon as he climbed into the back seat, barking an address without looking up from his phone. "Corner of Montgomery and Pine," he snapped. "And hurry." Elon didn't reply. He simply adjusted the car into gear and merged back into traffic. Unbelievable, the man muttered under his breath. I said hurry. Do you even understand what that means? Elon raised an eyebrow beneath his cap but said nothing. He'd met this type before, demanding, dismissive, and utterly convinced the world revolved around them. Normally, he'd have ignored the man entirely, but today, curiosity got the better of him. What's the rush? Elon asked after a moment. The man glanced up, clearly irritated by the question. Not that it's any of your business, but I have a meeting in 10 minutes. A very important meeting. Elon nodded, weaving through traffic with practiced precision. Must be a big deal. It is, the man snapped. You wouldn't understand. For a brief moment, Elon considered pulling the car over and telling the man exactly who he was and what he did understand. But he didn't. Instead, he let the silence stretch, allowing the man to stew in his own impatience. When they reached the address, the man threw a handful of bills onto the front seat without so much as a glance. Keep the change, he said curtly before slamming the door. Elon watched him stride into the building, his posture stiff with self-importance. Not everyone's story was worth lingering on. As the day wore on, the fog began to lift, revealing the sunlit skyline of the city. Elon continued his rounds, picking up passengers from all walks of life. Each one brought a new fragment of the city's story: a young musician clutching a guitar case, an elderly couple marveling at the sights, a nurse heading home after a long shift. With each ride, Elon felt himself slipping further into this role, shedding the layers of his usual life. It wasn't just about blending in, it was about seeing the world from a perspective he hadn't experienced in years. He realized how little most people noticed about the person driving them. They were too caught up in their own lives, their own worries, to consider who might be behind the wheel. It was humbling, in a way, being invisible in a world that often treated him like a spectacle. But invisibility had its perks. It allowed him to listen, to observe, to understand. Later that afternoon, he picked up a pair of teenagers. They slid into the back seat, giggling and whispering in conspiratorial tones. Dude, I'm telling you, it's him, one of them said, barely containing his excitement. You're crazy, the other replied. Why would someone like him be driving a taxi? Elon's ears perked up, but he kept his expression neutral. Where to? He asked casually. Union Square, one of them replied, still eyeing him suspiciously. As they drove, the conversation in the back seat continued, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional hushed argument. Look at the car, one of them whispered. It's electric. And he's wearing sunglasses inside. I'm telling you, this guy could totally be Musk. Elon suppressed a smile. You guys big fans of Elon Musk? He asked, glancing at them through the mirror. Yeah, the first teenager said, his eyes widening. He's a genius. I mean, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, it's insane what he's done. The second teenager rolled his eyes. Okay, sure, but that doesn't mean he's driving this taxi. Why would he do that? Elon shrugged, keeping his tone light. Maybe he wanted a change of pace. Both teenagers stared at him, their expressions shifting from disbelief to curiosity. Wait a second, the first one began, leaning forward slightly. Elon pulled up to their destination and gave them a polite smile. That'll be $10. The first teenager fumbled for cash, still eyeing him with suspicion. You're not, are you? Have a good day, guys, Elon said, tipping his cap as they climbed out. He couldn't help but chuckle as he watched them walk away, whispering animatedly to each other. The day was far from over, and the city still had more stories to tell. But for now, Elon was content to remain a mystery, just another face in the crowd, driving through the heartbeat of San Francisco. Elon's disguise as an ordinary driver wasn't just a costume, it was a choice. A deliberate step into a world where people judged you by appearances, where assumptions were made in an instant. And as the day wore on, he found that being underestimated wasn't just common, it was constant. The first real challenge came in the form of a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, standing on a busy corner with his arm raised. His briefcase gleamed as if it had been polished that morning, and the expression on his face screamed impatience. Elon pulled over, and the man got in without so much as a glance at him. "Head to the financial district," he said sharply. "And step on it, I'm already late." "Yes, sir," Elon replied, his voice steady, his expression neutral. The man didn't look up. He was too busy tapping furiously on his phone, alternating between muttering under his breath and barking commands to someone on the other end of the line. "I don't care if it's not ready," the man snapped. "You're the project manager, figure it out. That's what you're paid for." Elon glanced at the rearview mirror, observing the man without a word. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, but his mind was turning. "Why are we stopping?" the man demanded suddenly, looking up as the car slowed at a red light. Elon gestured to the signal ahead. "Traffic light." "Well, go around it or something. I don't have time for this." "Safety first," Elon said simply, his tone calm. The man huffed, clearly annoyed. "You drivers are all the same. No sense of urgency, no ambition. Just content to plod along at a snail's pace while the rest of us actually make something of ourselves." Elon didn't respond. He wasn't offended, he'd heard worse over the years, albeit in different contexts. But something about the man's arrogance struck a chord. The rest of the ride was spent in tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional bark from the man's phone conversations. When they finally arrived, the man threw a handful of cash onto the front seat and climbed out without so much as a thank you. Elon watched him disappear into the gleaming skyscraper, shaking his head slightly. It was a reminder of how people often viewed those they considered beneath them, an assumption Elon was here to challenge, even if they never realized it. The next passenger was a young woman in oversized sunglasses and a designer coat, her hair perfectly styled despite the wind whipping through the streets. She approached the car with the kind of confidence that suggested she rarely heard the word no. "Union Square," she said as she slid into the back seat. "And please, don't take the scenic route. I have an appointment." Elon nodded, pulling back into traffic. For the first few minutes, the ride was quiet, save for the sound of her typing furiously on her phone. But then she sighed loudly, glancing up at the meter. "Ugh, these prices are ridiculous," she muttered. "Traffic can make it worse," Elon replied, his tone even. "Well, can't you just drive faster? I swear, you drivers milk the clock just to squeeze more money out of us." Elon glanced at her through the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I'm driving at the speed limit," he said. "Whatever," she said with a wave of her hand, as if dismissing his explanation entirely. "Just don't make me late." The rest of the ride was spent with her complaining about everything from the weather to the unfairness of the parking rules in the city. When they finally arrived, she handed him a $20 bill and said, "Keep the change. You need it more than I do." Elon accepted the money with a polite nod, his face calm, but inside, he was shaking his head. He wasn't angry, he'd long since learned not to take these things personally. But it was a stark reminder of how people viewed the world and the people in it. Later that afternoon, Elon picked up a construction worker covered in dust and sweat, his boots leaving faint marks on the car's clean floor. "Thanks, man," the worker said as he climbed in. "Been a long day." "Where to?" Elon asked. "South of Market," the man replied, leaning back with a tired sigh. "Just trying to get home before the kids tear the place apart." Elon nodded, navigating through the city's growing traffic. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then the man chuckled softly. "You know," he said, "most drivers wouldn't stop for a guy like me." Elon glanced at him through the mirror, raising an eyebrow. Why not? The man shrugged. Dirt, I guess. They see the boots, the clothes, and they figure I'll mess up their car. Can't blame em, I guess. Elon didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Guess people don't realize everyone's just trying to get somewhere. The man looked up, surprised by the comment. He gave a small smile and nodded. By the time they reached the destination, the worker handed Elon a carefully folded bill. Thanks, man, he said again, climbing out. You're one of the good ones. Elon watched him walk away, his mind turning over the man's words. It was a stark contrast to some of his earlier passengers, and it struck him how much people's assumptions influenced their actions. But the most challenging interaction came just as the sun began to set. Elon picked up a group of 3 businessmen, their conversation loud and boisterous as they piled into the car. I'm telling you, one of them said, his voice carrying over the noise of the city, these drivers make bank. My cousin's a driver in L.A. He's pulling in 6 figures just from tips. Elon resisted the urge to laugh. Yeah, right, another chimed in. If they're making that much, why do they all drive these clunky old cars? You'd think they'd upgrade. Elon remained silent, focusing on the road. Hey, driver, the first man said suddenly, leaning forward. Is it true? You guys make a killing, don't you? Elon glanced at him through the mirror, his expression unreadable. Depends on the day, he said simply. Come on, the man pressed. Don't be modest. You're raking it in, aren't you? Elon didn't respond, keeping his focus on the road ahead. See? Told you, the man said, leaning back with a smug grin. For the rest of the ride, their conversation turned to mocking stories about drivers they'd encountered, each tale more exaggerated than the last. By the time they reached their destination, Elon was reminded once again of the importance of staying calm under pressure. He watched as the men walked away, their laughter echoing behind them, and let out a small sigh. He hadn't chosen this disguise for comfort or ease. He'd chosen it to understand the world differently, even if that meant facing moments like these. And while the day had brought its challenges, Elon knew there was still more to learn. As Elon drove through the city streets, the rhythm of the day ebbed and flowed with the demands of his passengers. Each stop presented a new opportunity to observe, to understand, and sometimes, to endure the attitudes of people who judged him solely on what they saw. Late in the afternoon, Elon pulled up to a busy cafe where a man in his early 30s waved him down. He wore a wrinkled shirt, his tie askew, and he carried a laptop bag slung over one shoulder. His face was flushed, a combination of the unrelenting heat and the frustration that seemed to pour off him in waves. Midtown, the man said tersely as he slid into the back seat, slamming the door harder than necessary. Elon glanced in the rearview mirror. Got it, he said, shifting into gear. The man let out an audible sigh, tapping furiously at his phone. His tone was sharp as he muttered to himself. Unbelievable. Just my luck. First the presentation crashes, then I get stuck with a driver who doesn't even have air conditioning. Elon resisted the urge to roll his eyes. The air conditioning was on set to a comfortable level, but the man seemed determined to complain regardless. Rough day? Elon asked, keeping his tone light. The man scoffed. You could say that. But hey, you wouldn't understand. You just drive people around all day, right? No deadlines, no pressure, no board meetings where your entire career is on the line. Elon said nothing, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't need to justify himself to this man or explain the weight of decisions he made on a daily basis, decisions that shaped industries, even the future. The man continued to rant, oblivious to Elon's silence. I mean, it's not like you have to worry about things like innovation or investors breathing down your neck. Must be nice, having such a simple job. Elon finally spoke, his tone measured. Sometimes simple jobs aren't as simple as they seem. The man paused, taken aback by the comment, but quickly brushed it off. Yeah, sure. Whatever. Just get me there on time. When they reached the destination, the man paid without a word of thanks and stepped out, slamming the door behind him. Elon watched him disappear into the towering office building, shaking his head slightly. The evening brought its own set of challenges. At a quiet corner near the Marina district, Elon picked up a group of college students who were clearly on their way to a night out. They stumbled into the car, laughing and chattering loudly, the smell of cheap cologne and perfume filling the air. Mission District, bro, one of them said, grinning widely. We're hitting the bars. Yeah, man, step on it, another chimed in. We don't want to waste the night sitting in traffic. Elon adjusted the rearview mirror and nodded. Got it? The ride started off uneventfully, but it didn't take long for their playful banter to turn into something less harmless. Hey, you ever think about upgrading this thing? One of them asked, tapping the back of Elon's seat. I mean, it's nice and all, but it's not exactly luxury, you know. Yeah, another added. I mean, if I were driving all day, I'd at least get something with leather seats. Maybe even a sunroof. Elon bit back a smile. The car did have leather seats and a sunroof, but clearly, these passengers weren't paying attention. Bet he's saving up for something better, the first one said, laughing. Gotta respect the hustle. Elon remained silent, his grip on the steering wheel firm. He'd encountered this type before, people who masked their condescension as humor, oblivious to how they came across. As they approached their destination, one of the students leaned forward, peering at Elon. Hey, you look kinda familiar, he said, squinting. You ever been on TV or something? Elon chuckled softly. I get that a lot, he said, keeping his tone light. The student didn't press further, distracted by the sight of neon lights outside the window. When they arrived, the group stumbled out, laughing and shouting as they headed toward the bars. Thanks, man, one of them called over his shoulder, tossing a crumpled bill onto the front seat. Elon sighed, watching them go. Their words hadn't bothered him, he was used to being underestimated. But it was a stark reminder of how much people missed when they only looked at the surface. Later that night, as the city's nightlife came alive, Elon picked up a woman in her early 40s. She was dressed in business attire, but her face showed signs of exhaustion. She climbed into the back seat with a small sigh, clutching her purse tightly. Downtown, she said quietly. The Marriott. Elon nodded, starting the car. For the first few minutes, the ride was silent. But then she spoke, her voice hesitant. You ever feel like no matter how hard you work, it's never enough? Elon glanced at her through the mirror, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes, he said. Why do you ask? She hesitated, then let out a bitter laugh. Because that's my life. I spend 12 hours a day in meetings, crunching numbers, trying to make other people's dreams come true. And for what? A pat on the back. A bigger bonus that barely makes up for the stress. Elon listened, saying nothing. They look at me and see someone who has it all together, she continued. But they don't see the cracks. They don't see how close I am to falling apart. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I'm sorry, she said after a moment, shaking her head. You didn't sign up to be my therapist. Elon smiled faintly. It's okay, he said. Sometimes talking helps. By the time they reached the hotel, she looked at him with a small, tired smile. Thanks, she said, handing him a folded bill. For listening. Elon nodded, watching as she disappeared into the brightly lit lobby. It wasn't the first time a passenger had shared their struggles, and it wouldn't be the last. But each story reminded him of why he'd chosen to step into this role, to see the world through different eyes, to understand the challenges that so many people faced. The night wore on, and Elon continued his rounds, navigating the city's winding streets and bustling neighborhoods. Each passenger brought their own story, their own challenges, their own assumptions. And with each ride, Elon found himself growing more attuned to the quiet struggles that often went unnoticed. For every impatient businessman or condescending college student, there was a hard-working parent, a dreamer chasing an opportunity, or someone simply trying to make it through the day. And as Elon's journey continued, so did the tension, the unspoken weight of being judged, misunderstood, and underestimated. But beneath it all was a quiet strength, a determination to prove that even in the simplest roles, there was power, purpose, and the potential to change the world. For now, though, he would remain in the background, just another driver navigating the city's stories. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of orange and pink. The air buzzed with the liveliness of the evening as Elon picked up his next passenger, a young man in his 20s with a skateboard tucked under one arm. He wore a hoodie and had a carefree demeanor, but his eyes were sharp, darting around as if cataloging every detail. "Market Street," the young man said as he slid into the back seat, the skateboard clattering against the door. Elon nodded, pulling into traffic. The ride began in silence, the man engrossed in his phone. But then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You don't drive like most cabbies," he said, his tone casual but curious. Elon glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "How do most cabbies drive?" "Fast, reckless, always looking like they're late for something," the man said, grinning. "You're different. Like you've got all the time in the world." Elon chuckled softly. "I like to keep things smooth." The man tilted his head, studying him. "You ever think about doing something else? You seem, I don't know, too calm for this gig. Like you've got a bigger plan or something." Elon's lips twitched into a faint smile, but he said nothing. The man didn't press further, turning back to his phone. But his words lingered, hanging in the air like a challenge. Later that evening, Elon's phone buzzed with a quiet notification. He glanced at it quickly, swiping it away before the passenger in the back seat could notice. But for a brief moment, the screen flashed with a message. "Prototype ready for review. ETA, 12 hours. The passenger, a middle-aged woman holding a stack of papers, didn't seem to notice. She was too busy flipping through her documents, muttering under her breath about deadlines and incompetent co-workers. Still, Elon's movements became just a bit sharper, his mind momentarily elsewhere. The message was a reminder that this wasn't just a casual experiment, it was a calculated step in a much larger plan. The next passenger was an elderly man with a walking cane, waiting patiently on the curb. Elon pulled up, stepping out to help him into the car. "Thank you, son," the man said with a warm smile. "Not many people take the time to help these days." "No problem," Elon replied, returning the smile. As they drove, the man chatted amiably, sharing stories of his younger days. But then he paused, studying Elon with a curious look. "You've got an interesting way about you," he said. "Like you're not just here to drive. Like you're watching, learning." Elon raised an eyebrow, his grip on the wheel steady. "What makes you say that?" The man chuckled. "I've seen a lot of people in my time. And you, my friend, don't fit the mold. You're too thoughtful." Elon smiled but didn't respond. The man's observation was accurate, but he wasn't about to confirm it. When they reached the destination, the man patted him on the shoulder. "Good luck with whatever you're really doing," he said with a wink. Elon watched him walk away, the words echoing in his mind. As the night wore on, Elon's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was brief but urgent. "Call needed. Final adjustments confirmed." He hesitated, glancing at his current passenger, a young woman with headphones in, oblivious to the world around her. The message wasn't unexpected, but it added another layer of urgency to the evening. Elon quickly typed a response before the passenger could notice. Acknowledged. Will connect shortly. The woman didn't seem to notice, lost in her music, but Elon's mind was already shifting gears. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the countdown had begun. It was during a quiet moment between rides that Elon received another notification, this one more cryptic. All systems green. Awaiting final input. Elon stared at the screen for a moment before pocketing his phone. The message was simple, but it carried immense weight. Everything he'd been working toward was coming together, and soon, the world would see the results. But for now, he was just a driver, blending into the city's rhythm, observing and waiting. His next passenger was a sharp-eyed teenage girl clutching a notebook. She climbed into the back seat, her eyes flicking around the car with curiosity. Union Square, she said, settling in. Elon nodded, starting the car. For the first few minutes, the ride was quiet. But then the girl spoke, her tone curious. You're not like most drivers. Elon glanced at her through the mirror. What makes you say that? She shrugged, flipping open her notebook. I don't know. You're too precise. Like you're thinking 3 steps ahead. Elon smiled faintly. Maybe I just like to be prepared. The girl studied him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. But you've got that vibe, you know? Like you're not just doing this for the money. Elon didn't respond, focusing on the road ahead. But her words struck a chord, a reminder that even in his disguise, certain things were hard to hide. As the hours passed, small details began to slip through the cracks. A quiet beep from Elon's phone here, a cryptic message there. Each moment added another layer of intrigue, a hint that there was more to this seemingly ordinary driver than met the eye. Passengers noticed his calm demeanor, his precise movements, and the subtle way he seemed to anticipate their needs before they voiced them. Some commented on it, others simply assumed he was particularly good at his job. But no one came close to guessing the truth. Elon's mind was always a step ahead, calculating and adapting, gathering information and refining his plan. And with each passing hour, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, building toward the moment when everything would be revealed. For now, he was content to let the world underestimate him. But soon, the mask would come off, and the city would see the driver for who he truly was. Elon continued his rounds, each ride seeming like just another ordinary trip through the streets of San Francisco. But beneath the surface, things were building. With every passenger, a small detail, a quiet message, or a fleeting glance added a piece to the growing puzzle. One particularly late-night ride brought him a young couple who seemed like they had just finished a romantic dinner. The woman, sitting in the front seat, leaned back with a smile, her hand resting on the man's arm. "Can you take us to the Presidio?" the man asked, his voice filled with a carefree tone. "Sure thing," Elon replied, glancing at them through the rearview mirror. The couple exchanged glances and then returned to their conversation, completely unaware of the quiet tension growing in Elon's mind. He wasn't just taking them to the Presidio tonight, he was observing them. Listening to their words, noticing the subtle shifts in their expressions. As they drove, the man spoke about his work. He was a tech entrepreneur, someone Elon had heard of before. His name wasn't well known, but his startup had started to gain traction in Silicon Valley. His words were full of pride and arrogance, bragging about his investments, his successes, and his future plans. The woman, on the other hand, seemed less enthusiastic. She nodded and smiled politely but didn't speak much. It was clear she had heard the same story 1,000 times before. "We're on the verge of something big," the man said, his eyes alight with excitement. The next phase of our project will revolutionize the market. I'm telling you, it's going to be massive. Elon listened closely, pretending to be just another driver who didn't care about their ambitions. But in truth, he was taking mental notes. The way the man spoke, the ideas he mentioned, he had seen these concepts before. In boardrooms. In meetings. Some of them were even ideas that had crossed his own mind at one point. Do you ever think about the bigger picture? Elon asked casually, his eyes still on the road. The man looked at him through the rearview mirror. What do you mean? I mean, Elon said, keeping his voice calm, your company sounds great. But you're focusing so much on the product. What about the impact? What about how it changes the world, not just the market? The man chuckled, clearly amused by the driver's comment. The product is everything, my friend. Without the product, there's nothing to change. But Elon didn't agree. The product was just a tool. It was the vision that shaped everything else. He'd learned that through years of experience in the world of innovation, though no one knew that side of him. Not yet, anyway. As they neared the Presidio, Elon's phone buzzed again. Another notification flashed across the screen. Status update, prototype ready for final tests. Time, 12 hours. He glanced at it quickly, then put the phone back into his pocket, keeping his focus on the road. He wasn't sure if this was the right time to make his next move, but everything was falling into place. The couple's destination arrived. They paid, thanked him half-heartedly, and exited the car. Elon watched them walk away, their shadows long in the fading light of the city. For a moment, he considered following them, but he knew he had bigger things ahead. The next day, Elon received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello, he said. Elon, a voice on the other end said, low and urgent. You know what's happening, right? Elon didn't answer immediately. He knew who this was, someone he hadn't heard from in years. Don't worry, the voice continued. We're in the final stages. Everything's coming together. You'll be able to act soon. Elon's pulse quickened. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady despite the excitement building inside him. The voice on the other end paused for a moment. Remember, patience. Everything has to be perfect. Don't do anything until you get the signal. I won't, Elon replied, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. I know what's at stake. The call ended abruptly, leaving him in a moment of silence. Everything was about to change, and it was happening much faster than he had anticipated. That evening, as the city's lights twinkled against the dark sky, Elon picked up a woman in her 40s. She climbed into the back seat, her heels clicking on the pavement as she adjusted herself in the car. South of Market, she said, her voice cool and professional. Elon nodded, pulling into traffic. The woman seemed distant, focused on her phone, but he couldn't help but notice the intensity in her posture. She looked like someone who had lived through 1,000 negotiations, someone who had dealt with high-stakes situations and come out on top. As they drove, she occasionally glanced at him, her eyes lingering on his face for just a second longer than necessary. Elon didn't break his gaze. You're quiet tonight, she said after a while. Most drivers try to make conversation. Elon smiled faintly. I don't mind silence. She studied him for a moment. You're not from around here, are you? Elon's heart skipped a beat. He didn't answer immediately. The woman was sharp, more observant than most. No, he said finally, keeping his tone neutral. I'm just passing through. She nodded, then turned back to her phone. But Elon noticed the way her eyes flicked back to him. She was assessing him, evaluating him, perhaps sensing that there was more to him than appeared. As the evening wore on, more passengers came and went. Each one unknowingly added to the slow unraveling of Elon's true identity. Some were friendly, some were rude, but all of them left him with a sense of quiet satisfaction. They didn't know who they were dealing with. But he did. One last passenger of the night was a young man in his late 20s. He climbed into the car with a briefcase in hand, looking stressed and worn out. "Head to the city center," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. Elon didn't need to ask why. The young man's appearance told a story all on its own. He was someone with a deadline, someone who was running out of time. "Long day?" Elon asked as they drove. The man sighed heavily. "You could say that. I'm in the middle of something big, but I'm stuck in traffic. I can't afford to be late." Elon glanced at him in the mirror. "Big meeting?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. It's a venture capitalist group. They're interested in my startup, but it's not a sure thing. If I mess up this meeting, everything's done. My whole company goes under." Elon nodded slowly. "That's a lot of pressure." The man didn't answer. Instead, he stared out of the window, lost in thought. Elon recognized the look on his face. It was the look of someone who had everything to lose. They drove in silence for the rest of the journey, the tension in the air palpable. When they reached the meeting location, the man handed him a credit card and gave him a brief nod. "Thanks," he muttered, already walking briskly toward the building. Elon watched him go, his mind still processing the conversation. He had seen that same intensity before, in other meetings, other rooms. But this time, something was different. The world was on the verge of a shift, and Elon's presence was no longer accidental. He was about to make his move, and the world would soon understand why they had underestimated him. The night had fallen deep, and the streets of San Francisco were bathed in a blanket of cool shadows. The car hummed along the road, and the tires whispered against the pavement, blending with the city's restless pulse. Inside, the driver's hands gripped the wheel with a practiced calmness, his eyes scanning the road ahead. But inside his mind, there was a storm of thoughts brewing, all focused on one thing, the moment when everything would change. Elon had been playing his part for weeks now. A quiet observer, a hidden figure in a world of noise. He had slipped past the boundaries, kept his secrets tucked away, and endured the endless chatter of the people around him. But he knew the time had come. The world was about to see who was really behind the wheel. He had been patient, listening carefully to the passengers, reading their reactions, understanding their fears, and calculating every move. It wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about gathering pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that had been in motion for years. And now, everything was aligned. The final step was ready. The passenger in the back seat tonight was a young woman, her face illuminated by the dim light of her phone. She had been quiet for most of the ride, only speaking to confirm the destination. She was lost in her thoughts, occasionally tapping on the screen in front of her, probably checking emails or scrolling through social media. Elon couldn't help but notice the way she held herself, tired, but with an energy beneath the surface that he recognized. He had met countless people during his time in the car, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own desires. But something about this woman seemed different. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a glimmer of ambition in the way she sat up straight, as if she was waiting for something, like she was just about to take a step into the unknown. And for a moment, Elon wondered if she had any idea who was driving her. As the car neared its destination, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. It was the final stretch, the final ride before everything was revealed. The streets outside were lined with tall buildings, their windows glowing with the flickering light of office spaces still at work long into the night. They were almost there. The destination, Tesla headquarters. Elon had been here countless times before, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just a CEO walking into a boardroom. Tonight, He wasn't just the man behind the vision. Tonight, he was someone else entirely. The young woman in the back seat looked up from her phone, glancing around as the car slowed. "We're almost there," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Elon didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, his hands steady on the wheel. The building ahead grew larger in the headlights. It was sleek and modern, a monument to the future he had helped shape. But for all its beauty, it wasn't the building that mattered. It was the story about to unfold. As the car came to a stop outside the towering glass structure, the woman in the back seat was looking out the window, unaware of the change that was about to hit her. She wasn't even looking at him, she was staring at the giant doors ahead, probably considering her next step, her next email, her next call. She had no idea who had been driving her all this time. Elon turned off the engine. The sound of the car shutting down seemed to echo in the night air. The woman didn't flinch. She was so absorbed in her world, she didn't even notice. And then, without warning, Elon reached up and pulled off his cap. Her eyes flicked toward him, and for the briefest moment, there was confusion in her gaze. Her expression shifted from passive indifference to surprise, then disbelief. It took her a full second to process what had just happened. But when she did, her jaw dropped, and her eyes widened as the unmistakable face of Elon Musk stared back at her. It wasn't just the face that shocked her, it was the realization of who she had been sitting next to for the past hour. The quiet, unassuming man who had been driving her around, who had listened to her complaints and shared her silence, wasn't just a driver. He wasn't just some ordinary man. He was Elon Musk, the very person she had heard about countless times in the news, the one whose companies had changed the world, whose name was synonymous with revolutionizing technology. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes flicked between him and the building outside, her brain struggling to catch up with the unfolding truth. Elon sat there, calm and composed, a grin slowly spreading across his face. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice smooth and assured. "I'll take it from here." The woman blinked, completely stunned, and then, before she could react, Elon swung open the door, stepped out, and walked toward the Tesla headquarters, his gait confident and assured. Behind him, the woman stayed frozen in place, her hands gripping the armrest as if trying to anchor herself to reality. She had been a part of something that, only moments ago, seemed like an ordinary ride. But now she realized she had just been in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone whose power, influence, and future shaped the world in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. As Elon entered the lobby of Tesla headquarters, the receptionist barely glanced up. She had been briefed earlier about the CEO's undercover experiment, how he would blend into the world for a while, testing people's assumptions, their behaviors, their willingness to see past appearances. But the impact of that moment, the reveal, would be felt far beyond the lobby. Elon had set the stage for something larger. In the elevator, as he ascended to the top floor, Elon reflected on the past few weeks. Every ride had been an experiment, a chance to observe human nature up close. He had seen the assumptions people made based on his outward appearance, or rather, the lack of it. He had seen the way they treated him, some with respect, others with indifference. But most didn't know who he really was. They didn't understand the power he held, the vision he had, or the future he was building. And tonight, that was about to change. When the elevator doors opened, Elon stepped into the conference room. The team waiting for him looked up in surprise. They had been preparing for his arrival, but they hadn't expected it to come like this. He stood there for a moment, letting them absorb the sight of him. He was no longer the man in the background. He was the man in control. "Sorry for the delay," Elon said with a casual smile, taking his seat at the head of the table. "It seems I got caught up in a little undercover work." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Everyone in the room had heard rumors, but no one had known for sure. The board members, the engineers, and the executives, all of them were caught off guard by the reveal. They had been discussing plans for the future, unaware that the person they had been discussing was right there in front of them. One of the engineers, still recovering from the shock, cleared his throat. "Mr. Musk. I didn't realize, we had no idea." Elon smiled again, his eyes gleaming with a mix of amusement and something deeper. "That's the point. Sometimes, the best way to understand the world is to see it through someone else's eyes. And sometimes, people can surprise you. Don't underestimate anyone. You never know who they really are." Outside the building, the young woman who had been in the back seat stood in stunned silence, her mind racing. She had just witnessed the most unexpected twist of her life. It was a twist that would stay with her forever, a reminder that appearances weren't always what they seemed, and the quietest person in the room might just hold the most power. As she walked away from the building, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was a text from a colleague, asking if she was ready for the big meeting tomorrow. She stared at it for a moment, then glanced back at the Tesla headquarters, where Elon Musk had just disappeared inside. She couldn't help but smile. Some people were born to change the world. And some people were born to stay hidden, only to reveal themselves at the most unexpected moment. And tonight, Elon Musk had done just that. The moment Elon stepped into the conference room, the whole atmosphere changed. There had been a sense of purpose, a rhythm to the discussion before, as team members discussed projections and strategies. But now, there was an unease, a ripple of uncertainty as the people who had been speaking with such confidence now had to recalibrate. No one had expected him to show up in this way. No one had expected the CEO of one of the most influential companies in the world to blend in with the crowd, to become one of the common people for a moment. The sharp shift in energy was tangible. He could see the discomfort in their faces, the quick glances they exchanged. Some were adjusting their ties nervously, others fidgeting with their pens, all trying to reconcile what they thought they knew about their leader with the unexpected figure before them. The room, which had been full of corporate jargon just moments ago, was now heavy with silence. Elon had done this before, countless times, but never quite like this. He had slipped into the shadows, away from the spotlight, testing his ideas, listening to people, absorbing how they viewed him, what they expected, and how much of that expectation shaped their actions. The world had always looked at him with a mixture of awe and criticism. But in this moment, no one knew what to make of him. He wasn't the CEO they admired from afar, he wasn't the figurehead they saw on magazine covers or in documentaries. He was something else entirely. And that was exactly what he wanted. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the faces around the table. The room was filled with high-ranking executives, engineers, and project leads, all of whom had their own areas of expertise. Some of them had been with Tesla for years, some had joined only recently, but they all shared one thing: they were here because they believed in Elon Musk's vision. They admired his boldness, his ability to see the future long before anyone else could. Yet none of them had realized the true nature of their leader. Elon allowed the silence to stretch on for a moment, watching as a few of the team members tried to regain their composure. He could feel the wheels turning in their heads, the questions forming, the shock slowly giving way to curiosity. Finally, someone spoke. "Mr. Musk." I mean, Elon," a senior engineer stammered, still in disbelief, "we had no idea you were. We thought you were in a meeting elsewhere. We didn't expect." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Elon let out a soft chuckle. "That's the point," he said, his voice light yet firm. "You didn't expect. The reality is, you never truly know who's sitting next to you, who's walking among you. You think you understand people, but most of the time, you don't. It's something I've learned over the years." Another engineer, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, shifted in her seat. "So this was a test?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "You wanted to see how we'd behave without knowing it was you?" Elon nodded slowly. "In a way, yes. But it's more than just testing behavior. It's about seeing how people react when they believe they're not being watched, when they think there's no consequence to their actions. It's about how easy it is to forget the power dynamics at play when there's no obvious authority figure in the room. It's about stripping away the expectations." There was a murmur in the room as the others processed his words. The room was still unsure how to respond. But this wasn't the kind of meeting where there would be quick answers or immediate resolutions. This was about something deeper. Elon's eyes flicked from one person to another, sensing the hesitation. It was clear that the dynamic had shifted. "You see," Elon continued, "when I'm in the office, in my usual position, I'm surrounded by people who treat me a certain way. They assume I know everything, that I have all the answers. But the truth is, no one can know everything. No one can predict the future perfectly. That's why I needed to understand how we think when there's no power structure hanging over us. How do we behave when we're left to our own devices?" A woman sitting at the far end of the table, the head of marketing, leaned forward, intrigued. "Are you saying we've been acting differently with you than we would with anyone else?" Elon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smiled slightly, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Yes. People always do. It's human nature. We want to impress the ones who hold power, to say the right things, to be on the right side of history. But when you strip away the expectations, what do you get? What is left?" The silence in the room deepened as everyone processed his words. No one spoke for a long moment. It wasn't that they were afraid of speaking, they just didn't know how to. This wasn't a meeting about profit margins, new products, or future innovations. This was a lesson in human nature, in power, in assumptions. Finally, one of the younger engineers broke the silence. "So, what does this mean for us?" he asked cautiously. Elon met his gaze. "It means that you need to think about your own assumptions. Not just about me, but about everyone around you. This exercise wasn't just for me to understand you, it was for you to understand yourselves. Who are we really when the rules are different? When no one is watching?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the team members exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear that this meeting wasn't about immediate answers. It wasn't about making decisions right now. It was about starting a conversation that would continue long after the meeting ended. Elon sat back, folding his arms across his chest. "I wanted you to realize something tonight. You don't need to know everything to succeed. Sometimes, you just need to see things differently. To challenge the assumptions that we live with every day. When you're willing to strip away the layers of expectations, that's when you'll find the real answers." The quiet continued. It was as if each person in the room was wrestling with the implications of Elon's words. It wasn't just a corporate lesson, it was a life lesson. A lesson in humility, in seeing beyond the surface. As the meeting dragged on, Elon found himself watching the reactions more than the words being spoken. The shock of the reveal had faded into contemplation, and now, each team member was processing what had just happened. Some looked uncertain, others intrigued, but no one seemed to have a clear answer. Finally, the room began to empty, one by one, the team members filing out with their minds still buzzing with questions. Elon was left alone in the room for a moment. He looked out the window at the sprawling city beneath him, feeling the weight of the decisions he had made, the path that lay ahead. It wasn't just about the company. It wasn't just about the products. It was about changing the way people thought, about making them question their own assumptions. He had taken a risk tonight. But then again, he always did. The young woman who had been in the back seat of the car earlier walked out of the room, her thoughts still far away. She couldn't shake the image of Elon Musk, the man who had been nothing more than a quiet driver just hours before. It was surreal. She had experienced something that most people could never imagine, something that would change her perspective forever. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. The woman paused, taking a deep breath as she looked up at the stars above. In the distance, the glowing lights of the Tesla headquarters seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if the building itself were a symbol of the change Elon Musk had been talking about. Change that wasn't just about technology, but about how we see the world. She pulled out her phone, ready to send a message. But for the first time, she hesitated. She couldn't help but wonder, was there more to the world than what she had seen so far? More to the people she interacted with than what they appeared to be? Maybe it was time to stop seeing things as they seemed and start looking deeper. Elon had made his point. The question was, would they learn from it? The soft hum of the elevator was the only sound as it descended from the top floors of the towering Tesla headquarters. Elon stood still, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, a calm expression on his face as the doors slid open. It had been a long night, but it wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. The events of the evening had unfolded exactly as he'd hoped. People had been shocked, unsettled, and, in many cases, deeply moved. It was strange how sometimes the most effective change came not from grand speeches or big announcements, but from small actions. By stepping into the shoes of a driver, someone ordinary, someone they didn't expect, he had forced them to confront their own biases, their own assumptions. Now, though, it was time for the final chapter. When the doors of the elevator opened, Elon stepped into the lobby. A few of the Tesla team members were still there, lingering, their voices a low murmur as they discussed the evening's unexpected twists. The energy in the room had changed. Gone was the sense of routine. Gone was the predictable order of things. Now, there was a palpable uncertainty in the air, a sense that things would never be the same again. The woman from earlier, the one who had been a passenger in his car, was sitting at a table near the back of the lobby. Her fingers tapped nervously on her phone, her brow furrowed in thought. She had been quiet throughout most of the evening, processing what had just happened, but now, she seemed ready to ask questions, ready to figure out what had just unfolded. Elon noticed her, his gaze briefly catching hers. There was no need to say anything just yet. He knew she understood the lesson. She had been paying attention. But there was still one thing left to do. He made his way to the back of the room where the rest of the leadership team had gathered. The tension among them was still thick, their conversation quieter now, more reflective. Some had been laughing nervously, others were deep in thought, trying to make sense of everything. Without a word, Elon walked to the front of the group and placed his hands on the table. The room grew silent instantly, and all eyes turned to him. "I think it's time we talk about the elephant in the room," Elon said, his voice steady and firm. "You see, everything that happened tonight, all of the confusion, the discomfort, it was intentional. I wanted you to experience what it's like when you're forced to confront your own biases. When you're made to question your assumptions. I wanted to see how you would react when you didn't know who was in the room with you." The CEO of Tesla paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the weight of his actions, the effect they were having. There was a quiet understanding among the group now. They had all been part of something much bigger than a simple test. It had been a lesson in human nature. "I want you to look around," he continued, "and understand that the people around you, your team, your employees, the ones who work for you, are just as valuable as anyone else in this company. You may have seen yourselves as more important, more deserving of attention. But the reality is, every single person here contributes in their own way." One of the engineers, the one who had first questioned him earlier, cleared his throat. But how does this all tie together? What does it mean for us now?" What's next? Elon's gaze softened for a moment, his tone becoming more reflective. What's next is about growth. It's about each of us understanding that we are not as separate as we think. We are all pieces of the same puzzle, and when we work together, we become stronger, more effective. We build the future together, not as individuals, but as a collective. He looked directly at the team, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. And it means that we need to confront the way we treat each other, the way we treat the world. The way we let our assumptions guide our decisions. There was a quiet moment, a pause where everyone seemed to consider his words. Finally, one of the senior executives stood up, his face slightly flushed. He looked around at the others, his gaze catching on the woman who had been a passenger in the car earlier. Her eyes were fixed on him, waiting for him to respond. I have to admit, I didn't see it before, the man said, his voice quieter now. I didn't understand how much we take for granted. How easy it is to fall into the trap of assuming we know what's best. We've all been guilty of it. We've treated people, treated our team, with a certain level of disregard. Elon nodded slowly. It's easy to fall into that trap, especially when you're in a position of power. But we have to change that. We have to lead by example. The conversation continued, but the tone had shifted. There was no longer any defensiveness in the room, no more prideful posturing. People were listening, truly listening, and they were beginning to see things from a new perspective. They understood that Elon's actions had been a catalyst for something much larger than a simple corporate meeting. By the end of the night, the room was filled with a new sense of purpose. The team began making plans, not just for the company's future, but for how they could change the way they interacted with each other. There was a collective sense of accountability now, something that had been missing before. As the night drew to a close, Elon made his way back to the elevator. The team was still buzzing with conversation, but there was a quiet sense of unity in the air. He had done what he set out to do. They were no longer just employees working for a paycheck. They were a team, united by a deeper understanding of the work they were doing and the people they were doing it for. Elon didn't need to say much more. He had shown them what needed to be done. The rest was up to them. The next morning, the team gathered for their regular strategy meeting. There was a new energy in the room, something different in the air. As the CEO of Tesla entered, there was no fanfare, no grand gestures. Instead, the team stood as one, acknowledging him not just as their boss, but as a partner in their shared vision. The rude passenger from earlier, the one who had made the harsh comment during the ride, had already gone through his own moment of reflection. He had been forced to reckon with his actions and the way he treated people without understanding them. As he sat at the table, he looked around at his colleagues with a new sense of respect. For the first time, he saw them for who they truly were, not as employees to be managed, but as equals to be valued. There was no more pretending, no more hidden agendas. The team knew they had been given an opportunity to grow, and they were ready to embrace it. They were no longer just people working for a company, they were people working for each other, for the greater good. Elon Musk, standing at the front of the room, felt a quiet satisfaction. The journey had been long, but this moment, the one that had begun with a simple act of humility, had been worth it. They had learned their lesson, and it had been a hard one. But it was one they wouldn't forget. Not ever. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, golden glow across the Tesla headquarters. The world outside the building hummed with activity, but inside, things were quieter now. The echoes of the events of the previous day lingered in the air, and a sense of calm had settled over the team. People were sitting in their offices, meeting rooms, and common spaces, reflecting on the lessons they had learned. It wasn't just the company that had changed, it was them, the individuals who made up the team. Elon Musk, standing in front of the large windows, gazed out at the city. His face was calm, but there was a flicker of thought behind his eyes, a sign that he, too, was processing what had happened. It had all started with something small, something so simple that no one would have suspected it could lead to such a profound change. But that was the thing, wasn't it? The most significant transformations in life often started from the smallest of actions, from the quietest moments. And now, here they were, a team of people who had been given a chance to look beyond their own assumptions and biases. They had been shown that there was more to the world and to each other than they had ever realized. Elon took a deep breath and turned away from the window. He knew that the real change had already begun. It wasn't about the headlines or the big speeches. It was about the quiet moments of realization, the internal shifts that happened when people began to see things differently. As he walked down the hallway, he passed by a few of the employees who had been part of the event the day before. Their conversations were different now. They spoke with more respect for each other, their words carrying a weight that had been absent before. They had learned something valuable that would shape the way they worked together from that point on. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It wasn't just about the tasks they had to complete or the deadlines they had to meet. It was about the people they worked with, the ones who made up their team. They had learned that there was more to a person than what met the eye. There were stories, struggles, and potential hidden beneath the surface, just waiting to be discovered. And that, Elon thought, was the most powerful lesson of all. Later that afternoon, the entire team gathered for a final meeting to discuss the changes they wanted to make moving forward. There was no grand speech this time, no dramatic gestures. Just a group of people, sitting together, ready to move forward with a new sense of purpose. The woman who had been a passenger in the car the night before spoke up first. She had been one of the ones who had questioned the actions of the ordinary driver. But now, she spoke with a newfound clarity. I think we all need to remember that it's not just about what people do, but about who they are. We've been working here for years, and yet, we never really looked at each other, not really. We never thought about what each person brings to the table, not just in terms of skills, but in terms of character. There was a nod of agreement from the others around the table. We've been focused on the wrong things, another team member added. We've been looking at titles, positions, and accomplishments. But the real value is in understanding the person behind all that. We can't judge someone based on what we think we know about them. We have to take the time to listen, to learn, and to appreciate the potential in everyone. The room fell silent for a moment, and then a few quiet murmurs of agreement followed. Elon stood back, watching as his team took ownership of the lessons they had learned. They had understood the message. They had seen the truth behind his actions. It wasn't about the big reveals or the dramatic moments. It was about the quiet, subtle shifts that happened within people when they took the time to truly understand each other. When they stopped assuming and started listening. That night, Elon sat alone in his office, the city lights twinkling outside the window. The quiet hum of the building felt peaceful now. The team had made a commitment to change, and they were already on the path to something better. But Elon knew that it wasn't over. Change was an ongoing process. It was something you had to choose every day. He thought back to the taxi ride. To the moments when the passengers had looked at him without recognizing who he was. They had treated him like any other driver, assuming he was just another person in the crowd. And in a way, they were right. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that he had a purpose that went beyond their expectations. Sometimes, he reflected, the world judges based on the surface. People are quick to make assumptions, quick to judge others by their appearance or by what they think they know about them. But the truth was, we are all more than what others see. There's always something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, and it's up to each of us to decide whether we let that potential remain untapped or whether we choose to bring it to light. It wasn't always easy. It required patience. It required resilience. But the rewards were worth it. Not just for him, but for everyone who took the time to see what lay beneath the surface of the people around them. As the day came to a close, Elon stood up from his desk and walked to the window once more. The sky was darkening, but the city was alive with possibility. He thought of the team, each person with their own hidden potential, their own story. They had taken a step toward understanding each other, toward embracing the idea that there was more to a person than what met the eye. And in that moment, Elon realized something important. The true power of a person wasn't in the titles they held, the money they made, or the fame they garnered. The true power lay in their ability to connect with others, to see them for who they really were, and to help them see the same in themselves. He smiled to himself, knowing that the journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, more lessons to learn, and more growth to achieve. But for now, he was content knowing that the team had begun to change. They had learned that sometimes, the most extraordinary people blend into the ordinary, and those who judge by what they see often miss the biggest surprises. Elon turned away from the window, feeling a sense of peace. The work ahead would be challenging, but it would also be rewarding. Because now, they had something better than just a company. They had a team. And that was the beginning of something extraordinary.